So I wanted to spend some time looking at like what you would see in a critical apparatus in the Greek New Testament,
Mhm.
because I think so in your book you talk about some of the considerations that come up with different manuscripts and whatever. It's a little bit abstract, and if you don't
Yeah.
know this world, you probably just don't understand what people are actually doing when they do this.
Yeah.
So recently I did this podcast called The Grammar of Good Friday and Easter, and the cry of dereliction is a very interesting one for multiple reasons. Eli, Eli, lama
Mhm.
sabachthani. And one of the reasons is the textual history. So I thought you could just walk us through what we're looking at when we see this. So let me share my screen here. So this is the text. So we have a difference between Matthew and Mark. Many people assume that Mark wrote first, so that Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani would be earlier in that sense. But then when we come to the actual Greek texts, so the main differences here being Eli, Eli, and Eloi, Eloi, right?
Mhm.
When we come to the Greek text, we have this. So this is just pulled straight from NA28. And again, if you are, someone that doesn't know what these things mean, they look like complete
Looks like
gibberish.
gibberish, yeah.
Exactly. So can you just tell us what does this gibberish mean? You don't have to tell us, all the nuances, but just give people
Yep.
an idea of
What's going
what
on?
we're doing. Yeah, when
Mhm.
when we look at
Yeah.
something like this.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just start by saying what you're looking at, first of all, is the evidence from the apparatus, okay? So what we call the apparatus is the part that records textual differences between witnesses. Now, I'm using the term witness now instead of manuscript because one of the things you'll notice here in your apparatus is it's not just Greek manuscripts. When you see something like for the first reading, Eloi, Eloi, right? Okay, just sorry about my pronunciation, guys. Okay, forgive me. But when you see VGMSS, I think the MSS will actually be a superscript in your printed edition, just so you know. But VG means Vulgate. Okay, the Latin Vulgate. So we're not even dealing with a Greek manuscript here. And in fact, we're dealing with multiple manuscripts of the Vulgate. Well, what is the Vulgate? It is a translation of the Bible into Latin. Okay. So in the next one, you see CO, that means Coptic. So we're referring again to a translation as a whole. They're not listing the particular manuscript of the Coptic now. They're just giving you the Coptic translation. And really, in this case, it could be more than one. Okay. So keep that in mind. You're dealing with, in the apparatus, you're dealing with more than just individual Greek manuscripts. You're at certain points dealing with whole translations that they'll sometimes almost list as a whole translation. Okay. All right. So what you've got then is, and you've hopefully got it listed out here, one on top of the other, you've got one variant after another. So each Greek text is giving you a different variation that's found in different witnesses. So the first one again, Eloi, Eloi. Then the next one, let's see.
So
Okay, well,
the Eloi, Eloi,
oh, I sorry.
you have an Aleph,
Have two.
a B, three,
Yeah.
three. Walk us through what
Yes.
what
See
what
what that is. Okay.
what are those?
So Aleph, so these then are going to be these are going to be witnesses. Okay. And basically what happens is because we have so many manuscripts, as we talked about, scholars have to have a way to reference them simply. Okay. If you were to go to a library, okay, like let's say you were to go to the British Library and want to see this first manuscript in your list, Aleph. Okay, that's Codex Sinaiticus. All right. If you ask them if you could see Codex Sinaiticus, well, they would. It's on the public display, so they'd say, "Yeah, go over there to that room." If you were like, "I'd like to spend some time with it personally," they'd say, "That's nice." Okay, or
What's your name?
unless you're the head librarian, no. Okay, but the point is, Codex Sinaiticus also has what's called a shelf number, and that's how the British Library knows it. I don't remember what it is offhand, but it's always like some kind of name and number. It's usually a name of whoever donated it to the library or something like this, or what part of sub collection is part of. The reason for mentioning that is if you go to a library and say, I want to see Codex, and then you give them the letter that's in your Nestle Aland, they will look at you like they don't know what you're talking about because that's not how they know their manuscripts. Okay. But if you were to put the shelf numbers for all these manuscripts in your apparatus, that'd be crazy huge apparatus. Nobody wants to spell out Codex Sinaiticus in your Nestle Aland every time it occurs. So what scholars have done over the centuries, I guess it's centuries now, century and a half or so, is they came up with these designations, okay? And they assigned letters and numbers to all of them to make it easier to refer to them and make it shorter, more succinct. Now, there's a fun story behind Aleph because initially when they started doing this, they distinguished between what we call majuscules and minuscules. Majuscules tend to be the older manuscripts, and they're written in what we might call capital letters, okay? Minuscules are written in what's a Greek-like script style. You could kind of think of it as lowercase. It's not technically right. It's better to think of it as a script where the scribe doesn't lift the pen, but rather connects the letters to each other. That's the main difference. But they distinguish these two, okay? So minuscules get a number. So 33, you see there? That's a minuscule. It happens to be a really famous one. It's sometimes called the Queen of the Cursives because I think it's a near complete New Testament, and it has a really good text, even though it's from the Middle Ages. Okay, it has an old text. You can see that's why it agrees there with Sinaiticus and B. That's really interesting, right? Here you've got a medieval manuscript that's agreeing with the 4th century manuscript at this point at the level of spelling. Okay, now Aleph then, the reason I'm telling this long story is because you see B next to Aleph. B is Codex Vaticanus, which is from the 4th century, the other major 4th century manuscript we have of the New Testament. Also includes the Septuagint, but Aleph is given that designation because the guy who discovered it, okay, and there's a story behind his discovery. He discovered at the monastery of Mount Sinai, which is the longest continuous running monastery in the world. And he went there, and his story is that he saw the monks tearing pages out and putting them into the fire to stay warm. Okay. And he sort of, his version of the story is roughly that he rescued the manuscript. Okay. Their version of the story, you might imagine, is different. Their version is something more like he stole it. Okay. But in any case, he got the manuscript from them. He gave it to the Russians who were paying for his trip to this monastery. The Russians later got hard up for money and they sold it to the British. So that's why the bulk of Codex Sinaiticus is now at the British Library in London. Okay. But when the guy who discovered, his name is Konstantin von Tischendorf, when he discovered it, he also happened to be a good text critic, and he produced his own editions of the Greek New Testament with a big apparatus. Okay, so he discovers this manuscript and immediately recognizes it's really significant. And he's got to give it a letter designation for his apparatus, right? The problem is by this point, all the letters of the English alphabet have been picked. They've been used, and they've already started using Greek letters, right? So he knows if he gives us like letter omega, let's say, okay, where's it going to be in his list of manuscripts and apparatus? It's going to be at the end every time. And he's like, no, there's no way I'm letting my prize manuscript be at the end of the list. Okay. So he picks a Hebrew letter, so it gets to be at the front of the line every time. And to this date, then, it's the only manuscript that has a Hebrew letter designation, because what happened is people started to realize quickly, hey, we're running out of letters, and let's not use Hebrew letters in a Greek New Testament, right? So anyways, this is a little bit of a fun personal anecdote there behind that. But anyways, Sinaiticus then is the first one you've got there. That's the Aleph there. That's otherwise known as O1. That's its numerical designation. Okay. B is Vaticanus, otherwise known as O3. Those are two very important manuscripts from the 4th century. Okay. Then you've got manuscripts of the Vulgate. Then you've got Coptic. All right. Then TXT there, and you can see that little bar in between, that little broken bar with the space in between. That's telling you, okay, here's a different reading, but at the same place in the text. And then the TXT is telling you, now we're going to give you the manuscripts for the reading that's in your text, in the main text of the Nestle Lawn. So what is it? Now this is
So in this case,
Ailey,
it's
Ailey.
Ailey.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So now we've got a series of more manuscripts, A, D, and K. All right. Then L is in parentheses because they're saying, hey, there's a little bit of a sub variation here. L doesn't exactly read what's in the text, but it's close enough. We're going to combine it. Okay. Unfortunately, the apparatus doesn't tell you what it is. Now, thankfully, today you could go online and look up that manuscript and actually see the picture. I didn't bother to check. I could check my big apparatus here and tell you where we at. Oh no, it's Matthew. Sorry, I thought we were in Mark. Okay, sorry, I can't tell you.
It's okay.
But you could look it up and it'd be some kind of subvariation. Then you have W, gamma, delta, theta. Okay, and then F1 refers to a whole family of manuscripts. These are Greek manuscripts that are so closely related that we can actually draw like a family tree for them and say, here's the grandpa, here's the son, here's the grandson, that sort of thing. Okay. So we tend to group those whole manuscripts together, and actually family 13 is another one. So you see F1 period 13, that means family 1 and 13. This apparatus is done by Germans, and Germans tend to use periods where Americans might use a comma. Okay. So that's what all the periods are doing in this apparatus. Think of them just like commas. Okay. Then you get into what are called the minuscules. Well, the family 1 and 13 are also minuscules, but 565 is a minuscule, so it's from the 9th century or later, because that's when that style of handwriting enters or starts getting used. So, and then you get a series of minuscules all the way to 1424, and then the next one, that's not actually a 1 in your apparatus. That would be an italic L, and that means L844. That's a lectionary. Okay, so there's another category of manuscripts that we use. Lectionaries are, for our low church evangelicals listening to this like me, the lectionary is, if you were to go to, say, an Anglican church or a Catholic church, their services are organized by the lectionary, which is you take the Bible and you break it up into to readings that are read out loud in church depending on the Sunday. Okay. And so a lectionary manuscript might have a reading from Matthew, which is what we've got here. And then the very next reading might be from Mark, and the next one is from Luke, and they're like excerpts or snippets. Okay. Then that M there is a Gothic M that refers to the majority text, which means essentially the majority of manuscripts, which means the majority of later medieval manuscripts, because that's where the majority is. Okay. Then you get LAT, and that means Latin. So that means the rest of the Latin tradition, aside from those Vulgate manuscripts. Okay. So that would be the Old Latin, and then whatever the other Vulgate manuscripts are that don't have LOE. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
so yeah, that's really helpful. So just going through, I mean, looking at this and with comparing the two texts, it seems like there are a lot of, I mean, there's pretty strong evidence for both in that Eloi is early,
Yep. That's
with
right.
several good manuscripts. But then there's in terms of just sheer number, the Eli text is more frequent.
Uh-huh.
So if you just go back to, again, what you would see in your actual Greek New Testament,
Mm.
help us to see, like, what are the considerations for why the editors of NA28 would choose Eli Eli. My assumption would be, okay, if Eloi is in Mark,
Mhm.
there's going to be a tendency to harmonize
Yep.
those two, especially assuming the Mark is earlier, we would
Mhm.
harmonize Matthew to Mark, and then that would explain these variants here, and then these other ones would really be left without an explanation, which would make them probably the better reading.
Yeah. So
Is
you're
that how
always
we should think about it?
yeah, the fundamental question we're always asking when we encounter these differences is which reading gives us the best explanation for how the other one came about? Or you could flip it and say it the other way, just say which reading can we not explain without the other one? Does that
Right,
make sense? Okay.
right.
So you've already given a couple suggestions. And yes, if you've got Eloi in Mark, what is it, Mark 1534,
Yeah.
then yeah, you can imagine a scribe being familiar with that version in Mark and putting it here. Now, if I remember right, in Mark, what is it? Sorry, 1534. In Mark, I think you have Eli in Mark, I think, in some manuscripts as well, don't
Yes.
you? Yeah. So
Yeah.
here's where things get really dicey.
So this is here the I pulled it up the for Mark.
Oh
Eli
yeah, there you go.
Eli is in these
Yes.
manuscripts.
There you go. Okay. Now, the issue here is you got to say, well, okay, well, this means harmonization could have happened in both directions. And so there's a danger as a scholar that you end up with viciously circular reasoning, right? Where you go, oh, well, the Ailey reading has to be original in Matthew because it's different from what's in Mark, and not realize that what you're thinking of as Mark is really just what's in your editorialized text,
Right.
right? But if Ailey is original to Mark, well, then maybe scribes have that in their manuscript, and so they're actually harmonizing Matthew, and they're changing Eloi in Matthew to Ailey to match what they have in Mark, right? And I think it's probably fair to say that I'd have to look at all the evidence, okay? But this is just off the cuff, okay? But it's certainly plausible that harmonization did actually, in history, happen both directions, right? Because you got to remember, any given scribe does not necessarily have the original text in his manuscript at both places. He might have Ailey when he's copying Matthew first, and so by the time he gets to Mark, that's what he's harmonizing to, right? Another scribe might have Eloi in his copy of Matthew, so by the time he gets to Mark, he's going to copy Eloi in Mark. Do you see? So the first place we want to start actually in this variant is actually compare both side by side and see how many manuscripts are actually harmonized between the two in the same
Mm,
manuscript and how many aren't. Because actually, it's the ones that aren't harmonized that are probably the most interesting to us. We're not surprised when we find them harmonized. It's
right.
actually more surprising when they're not. So we'd actually want to start with those manuscripts. I'd be most interested in those manuscripts that aren't harmonized and start asking questions about them, right?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And so we don't have to, like, go through all of it, but I think this gives people an idea of the complexity involved. I mean, there's actually a lot to think through. All that to say, even in something like this, which, it's like, yeah, it'd be nice to know exactly what you just said,
Yeah,
in this
yeah.
case. It's still the variation that we're talking about
Mhm.
is really not meaningfully significant, right? I mean, this
Well,
in
yeah,
my
it's not like
reading of it.
It's not like in either case, Jesus says, my God, you haven't forsaken me."
Right, right,
Do you know what I mean? Like,
right.
so
I would say
we do have to
Eli
keep
is
that in mind.
Hebrew and Eloi is Aramaic,
Yeah,
and
that's
so they're
fine.
just trying to figure out,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
again, we're talking about a very, very slight difference. Even, yeah, I mean,
Well, and here's where I mean, the reason this variant is so interesting is partly there's a number of levels to it, right? We can ask questions like, well, what language would we expect Jesus to speak from the cross
right,
in his moment of greatest agony? Is he, if I put it this way, is he defaulting to his heart language at that moment?
yeah. And what is
Or
that language?
what is that language? What is that language? Or actually, is he not because he's quoting scripture?
Hmm.
So we actually it would be expecting him to speak Hebrew at that point, which would not be his, let's assume, maybe not his heart language as much. Do you know what I mean? In the
Yep,
same
yep,
way, anybody in my class, if I start the Lord's Prayer in the King James Version, I've got a number of students who can finish it in the King James for me.
yep.
Because Elizabethan English is their heart language? No. Because that is a very familiar form of the Bible to them.
Right,
Right.
right.
Okay, so you get into questions about what Jesus spoke from the cross, but then you also get into questions about like what Matthew or Mark might have given to their readers. And then additionally, you can get into questions about like what would scribes have even known? By the
Right.
ninth century, am I expecting a Greek scribe copying this in Constantinople to be sensitive to the differences between Hebrew and Aramaic? As
Right.
much as Kevin Grasso is? No, I'm not, right? But there are interesting questions you can ask about that. When does that happen? Is it by the 4th century? I might expect. But then, wow, it's interesting that we have some 4th century manuscripts that you're saying are preserving the Aramaic version for
Well,
this.
and to your point too, again, these scribes are people,
Interesting.
so
Yeah.
like they're just going to vary in terms of their own knowledge of the background
Mhm.
and all these things. And this is again not a solution to the problem, but to point out, one, that this is counted as many of the variants, right? Which again is important, but it's not meaningfully important, right? In the sense that
Yeah.
like we're not going to change anything about
Yeah.
what we know about Christianity
Yeah.
from this, whether Jesus was speaking Aramaic or Hebrew here.
The way I like
But
to say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
go ahead, go ahead.
The way I like to say it is, does this matter? And the question is, matter to whom
Right,
and for what?
right.
So does
To
it
us,
matter
sure, but
does it matter to my mom doing her morning devotions? No, I don't
right,
think so. Does it matter to the preacher? Probably not. I don't think I've ever mentioned Aramaic from the pulpit as
right,
preacher. That doesn't mean I don't need to know it, but I'm just saying I've never been like, "Okay, guys, now let's make sure you all know that for the application this week that Jesus is speaking Aramaic." Like, but does it matter for somebody writing a commentary? Probably. Does it matter again for people who have questions about things like how do they spell things in Greek? Yep. Does it matter for people who have questions about, like, I wonder if scribes of the New Testament did know Hebrew or Aramaic? Yep. Does it matter for people asking questions about what language Jesus spoke and taught in? Yes, right? So does it matter? Yes. It wouldn't be in your apparatus if it didn't matter for something, right? But we just have to distinguish what level does it matter at and who does it matter for. I think that's a helpful way to think about this.
yeah, no, I think that's spot on.